What's going on, YouTube? My name is Mr. Crippled, and today I'm going to be bringing you my Kukulkan guide. Now, before we get into the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you'd like to keep up with any future content, I will be leaving a link to my Discord and my Twitch in the description below. Now, um, Kukulkan is interesting. He's definitely the easiest mage ever to pick up, besides maybe Zeus. Um, in Smite in general, both in Smite 1 and in Smite 2. However, in this game, he did receive a slight buff to one of his abilities, and I'll be going over that here in a moment. But he's definitely one of the easiest people to pick up. But since Smite 2 is a little bit new, it can be a little bit weird to build him and to kind of understand how his kit works and what you should be focusing on. Kukulkan is a complete mage. He is a burst mage dependent on his intelligence. And his passive, we go ahead and jump right into it, is that as you build mana or build items that provide mana, you gain bonus intelligence. This doesn't scale off the god's base mana, so as you level up, you're not just gonna get a huge power spike because you're just leveling up and getting mana. It's purely dependent on the items that you build, but there's an abundance of items that are made for him, and several items in the game that were buffed that make Kukulkan an extreme threat in this game. In Smite 1, he was kind of just he still fulfilled his role really well, but he was mostly kind of just burst and bully the squishies with the random ult on occasion. But he had to sacrifice a lot of meta or core cards to do really crazy damage. But now with some of the changes, he is in a really good spot. If you've watched my videos before, I do go over his abilities in order of least important to most important. This is not going to be any different. And for Kukulkan, his least important ability, even though it did see a buff, is his 2, Slipstream. Now, if you played old school Smite, this move really wasn't anything to cry home about. It did make you slow immune, and gave you a pretty nice bit of attack, not attack speed, but movement speed, and the buff lasted for a pretty long time. But they changed it now to where it can do damage depending on if he activates it in his 3, which is probably his most important ability, and we'll go over that in a moment. The damage is pretty nice, doing 285 damage, and then it has 85% scaling, which is pretty good. And it does have a slow. As you level it up, it upgrades to about a 40% slow. This isn't his primary slow, but it is still nice regardless. In most cases, you're probably going to be using this to run away. You're not really going to be using this to engage. You're going to be using this as kind of like a get off me tool. And I'll show you how that looks now. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and showcase how the 2 works. Now, I will have to basically show you how the 3 looks. That's for you to be able to see it. But it can only activate once this tornado is down and you're standing in the middle of it. So if you activate your 3 and then activate your 2, you can see that now that it's a little line. And it does a pretty hefty amount of damage. 220 base. Or my fault. It does 285 damage base because Ymir has natural protections, but the move can be pretty nice. It does give you a little bit of distance, and it can provide some pretty decent DPS if you really are trying to dive the person. But because of the prerequisites, you're not really going to be using it too much, and the main use you're going to be using for is just the base 2. It does give you a pretty nice amount of movement speed. To really get a lot of benefit out of this, you would have to build like a Doom Orb or something on top of it to make the movement speed really matter. Be careful spamming this ability. Since this is his only movement ability, and it's not really even a movement ability, and it's on a fairly long cooldown with 11 seconds, use this ability sparingly. Back in Smite 1, people used to just drop the 3, pop the 2, and run away to create distance. Now that there's an actual utility use for it, or DPS use for this, be very mindful of how you're using it. Especially since, like, you can use this, you drop a tornado down, like a good situation where you're probably going to be running, is you're going to drop your 3 on top of yourself and immediately dash away. or wait until you at least get to the edge of the tornado and then dash away while they're on you. That way you can at least get some kind of damage off with the tornado and the 2, and put a slow on them to increase your chances to run away. So use this move sparingly. However, in the grand scheme of things, you're really not going to be using this ability more than your 3 and your 1, since those are your primary pokes and DPS abilities, which I'll go ahead and go over now. So his next important ability is his 1. This is his lowest cooldown ability, so you would think you would be spamming this a lot more, when you kind of are, but this isn't your primary source of DPS. Basically, he just spits out some wind. It hits a primary person and does a little bit of splash, damaging enemies around him. It does do a hefty 285 plus 80% intelligence scaling. But this is also a slow. It has a 40% slow at max rank, and it lasts for 3 seconds. Unlike this 2, which it does last for the same amount of time, and it does put the same slow, it's more of a poke tool than it is a runaway tool. So you'll be clearing and then trying to hit the other person with the 1 just to get as much damage as possible. But this, on top of that, this really is a skill shot too. It doesn't really take too long to get used to the aim and how it works, but in most cases, this isn't going to be your primary source of damage, even though it can do crazy amounts, and I'll go ahead and showcase what that looks like now. Okay, so as you can see, the 1 is pretty small. It can be a little deceptive in its range, though, and how wide it actually is. But if you look, you can see there's a little bit of a splash around the primary target you're going to be hitting, and it does do the same amount of damage to the initial person as to the extra people, as well as the initial people. Move's not too much to cry home about. It does have a pretty long range, so that this is a really good sniping tool. And if you hit the ability, all targets that are hit, whether it's the splash damage or the primary damage, is going to be slowed. So this ability is really nice. In conjunction with your other abilities, you're probably going to be throwing your 1 first and then trying to hit your 3. That way it's a lot easier to hit. Especially since your 3 is going to be your primary source of damage. And with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into his most important ability, his 3, Whirlwind. Now, his 3 is what makes Kukulkan. It's a huge AoE that does take damage. And even though the scaling, it looks like the scaling is pretty low and the damage per take is pretty low, this does crazy amounts of damage once late game hits. And then it is only on an 11-second cooldown. It does start at 15, so it is fairly long at the beginning, but you can subsequent that with a lot of cooldown items, or like Spirit Deso, or just the amount of damage you can pump out just by building mana. It's very simple. The second that an enemy touches it, even once they step outside of it, they're going to take the full tick damage from this ability. And it takes 6 times over 2.5 seconds, so 36 times 6 over 2.5 seconds. It's kind of, it adds up. As I showcased a little earlier, this move has crazy amounts of range, can hit basically both the wave and the enemy god if you space it correctly. Can cast this relatively safe. There's not a lot of people who can like stop you from dropping this tornado. And with no items, can still do pretty decent amounts of damage. Now, at the base level, it doesn't do a lot, not without adding into his passive. And we'll go over his best items to really make this ability hurt, and I'll re-showcase it later. This is going to be your go-to clear. It's going to be your go-to for team fights. It's going to trump basically everything and sets up the rest of his kit to actually do incredible amounts of damage. So last but not least, I want to go ahead and talk about his ultimate and go ahead and go over his best builds and his best go-to items. His ultimate, while it hits insanely hard, there's not much to cry home about. It's just a skill shot ultimate, huge line. If you hit it, they get knocked up. Probably one of the harder hitting base gods. I think the highest damage I was able to pump out with this being roughly about 16 to 1800 damage on initial cast. So the ultimate can hurt and really does set up team fights. It's a good engager. It's a good snipe. It's a good deterrent. Everything about this ultimate is good, but it's not something we really need to go over. As you can see, line is huge, and no items. Still did around 600 and then 501 DPS. So ultimate hits really hard. It is on a fairly long cooldown, but again, you could subsequent that with cooldown items. You know, Chronos Pendant, Spirit Deso, World Stone, stuff like that. But let's go ahead and go into his best items. Now, for the starter, it's really up to you. I recommend only building into Sands of Time. That way you can get this 20 CDR at the end. Plus, this does grant you more intelligence per availability of your mana, so your abilities will hit extremely hard. If you're okay with a little bit less cooldowns, or you plan to build on build more cooldown items here at the bottom, Conduit Gem is also a really good option since it does give you mana. Plus, it gives you true damage on the minion wave, so your 3 will hit even harder. And then, the passive, you deal an additional 40% of your max intelligence on your next ability cast every 20 seconds. So getting hit by an ultimate out of nowhere, getting hit by that 3 out of nowhere, especially with all the extra intelligence you're going to be getting with how much mana you're going to be building. These two cards are really good for him. Personally, I still think Sands of Time is better just for the extra CDR, but for the burst, Conduit Gem is definitely a good go-to. For staple items, it's very obvious. Book of Thoth, it is and always will be his card, giving you a whopping 400 mana at the beginning with mana regen now. And then it does, you gain more mana depending on how much, depending on the amount of damage you do, stacking up to a maximum of 50 times. And you gain intelligence equal to 4% of your mana items, and this does stack with his passive. And then once it evolves, it actually gives him 10 penetration, and instead of 4% of your 4% of your mana, you gain increased intelligence equal to 7% of your mana. So this will end up helping you hit harder late game. Overall, this is his card. You're going to be building this first in most builds. If you don't build this first, the only other item that I can see taking that place is Doom Orb, since it does give you intelligence, mana, and pen. And it gives you the penetration right out the gate, so you don't have to worry about stacking. But Kukulkan stacks so fast that Book of Thoth is more than likely going to be the go-to. The only time, in my opinion, you'd probably be building Doom Orb over Book of Thoth is if you're probably playing Arena or a game mode where it's harder for you to stack as a person, but because now stacks are built depending on the damage you do and the minions you kill, there's really no reason not to build it. Up next, in my opinion, the next best card that is a must-have on every Kukulkan build is Divine Ruin. It has way too much utility. It gives a good amount of intelligence. It has anti-heal built into the kit. And on top of that, they gave it mana, which will directly affect Kukulkan's passive. So you gain a whole utility item that also gives you more power than the rest of the cast. So this is definitely a go-to. Another go-to card, in my opinion, is Spirit Deso. Spirit Deso, that may not give you any mana, but whenever you get a kill or you get an assist, you gain, your cooldowns are reduced by 2 seconds, and then your ultimate is reduced by 6. So Spirit Deso is definitely going to help him with the cooldown problem. Next item that I recommend building 100% is Soul Reaver. Soul Reaver, before, there really wasn't a point to build it in the first game. Yeah, tanks were tanky, but it didn't give you a lot of power, and it didn't give you any pen. In this game, it took away a little bit of the damage, but they gave it 10% pen. And then it made it to where this card will always deal minimum 5% of the god's max HP over time. So every time you hit an ability, this card will take away 5% of their maximum health. So it's really detrimental to tanks, and it already has built-in pen. So this card is going to make any Kukulkan build hurt. Definitely one of the better items. After that, it's kind of up to you. Personally, I think Rata Hootie is a really good item to build here. Gives mana, regen, it still gives 10% pen, and then you gain more intelligence equal to 20% of the intelligence you're already gaining from items. It doesn't come from your passive, unfortunately, but since you are still getting extra power, this is still a really good staple. I believe Soul Gem can be good in some situations, given the fact that you're going to be spamming that 1, you're going to be spamming your 3, and it can be good for just for a little bit of extra sustain. But if you're looking for sustain, Bloodbound Book is always good since it gives you cooldowns, lifesteal, intelligence, and then the active gives you 10% of your max HP plus 80% of your intelligence as an HP shield. So it can be good in a pinch. But again, Kukulkan really doesn't need too much sustain, but this does work. Also, lifesteal items. Wonder they did. They took away the ability. Well, back in Smite 1, there used to be Typhon's Fang and Bancroft's Talon, which actually had mana built into it, which had sustain on it as well. And since they're not in this game, you're more than likely not going to be putting any lifesteal on this character. But if you absolutely need anything, then just build Bloodbound Book. Another good card, as I said before, Totem of Death is really good. The only problem I have with Totem of Death is that it doesn't give any power. So you're going to be sacrificing a lot of power for, albeit 35% pen, but it's not, I'm not 100% sure that it's worth it. But it can be good in some situations. World Stone is also okay if you're trying to spam the ultimate. It does give 10 cooldown rate, gives a little bit of mana, and reduces your ultimate cooldown by 20%, so that's always really nice. And then finally, actually, I believe that's it. There's not really, mage builds are very straightforward. There's not really a lot of cards that you're going to really deviate from. The only other card, last recommendation, is probably Chronos Pendant, since every 10 seconds your cooldowns are reduced by 1 second. So again, can help with the cooldown problem, but it doesn't give much utility outside of that besides the cooldowns. So it can be good for him, can be bad, depending on the build that you want to go. And that will be it for the Kukulkan guide. Kukulkan is very straightforward. I didn't expect this video to be extremely long. Very easy to pick up, probably the most accessible mage in the game, besides maybe like Zeus, but even Zeus has some issues that'll make it for lower ranked players or beginner players to kind of get into. Kukulkan, you just mash your face across the controller and profit as long as you have aim. But if you like the video, if you have any of the comments, or if you wanted to request any other god that I do next, please leave a comment in the comment section below. Thank y'all for your time, and y'all have a nice rest of your night.